Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I see many of you are joining in very exciting discussion that we're going to have today on cities and buildings in transition, systems change for a resilient future. For who doesn't know me, I'm Rogier Vandenberg. I'm the Global Director of the Ross Center for Sustainable Cities, which is the cities program of World Resources Institute. And I have the honor today to moderate and host this session that we're having together in partnership with Systems Change Lab and the New Climate Institute. With this webinar, we are celebrating the official launch of the cities and building systems on the Systems Change Lab data platform on World Cities Day. So happy World Cities Day, everyone. It's a special day. The United Nations established World Cities Day to really promote and address urbanization, but also push for global cooperation in sustainable urban development and creating solutions together to address urbanization issues. We're very honored today to have on World Cities Day an address by Ana Claudia Rosbach, the Under-Secretary General of the United Nations, the new Executive Director of UN Habitat, the Human Settlements Program. Unfortunately, she is not here with us in person, but she has recorded an address. She is now live, I think, if I'm right, in Alexandria, in Egypt, addressing World Cities Day there, just ahead of World Urban Forum in Cairo, which will kick off next week. So thank you once more for joining. I'm very excited to have Ana Claudia address this very important session today. Ana Claudia, I know already for a long time. She's been very passionate and very dedicated addressing urban settlement issues, especially if it comes down to informal settlements, social housing, and how to work in partnerships on getting these issues done. So we are all looking very much forward for her new and fresh direction giving to UN Habitat for the coming years. So with no further ado, I want to ask the technical team to start the address of Ana Claudia Rosbach.
Honorable guests, distinguished delegates, colleagues, friends, ladies and gentlemen. A very good morning, afternoon, evening to all of you. It's an honor and a privilege to address this esteemed gathering at the high-level launch of the Systems Change Lab's Cities System. On this special day, the World Cities Day. As you know, cities are not just the frontline victims of climate change. They are also critical levers for climate action. Over half of the global population resides in urban areas, and this number is steadily increasing. Urban centers contribute significantly to greenhouse gas emissions, but also hold the keys to innovative solutions for both mitigation and adaptation. The current state of the world's cities and building systems is a mix of remarkable progress and alarming shortcomings. On the one hand, we have seen technological advancements and sustainable initiatives sprouting in various urban centers. On the other hand, many cities continue to expand unsustainably, with inefficient buildings and infrastructure contributing to environmental degradation. One of the most pressing aspects of this inclusiveness is the need to embed informal settlements in urban planning and our integrated urban data systems as we seek to address both current and future housing needs. Informal settlements are home to millions of people worldwide, and they reflect the acute housing shortage that many cities face. These communities, often underserved and vulnerable, must not be marginalized in our efforts to create sustainable and resilient urban environments. By 2030 and 2050, our goal is clear: to create cities that are sustainable, resilient, and inclusive, aligning with the ambitions of the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement. Achieving this requires a fundamental shift, a systems transformation, and the right enabling factors. Progressive policies, adequate financing, effective governance, and strategic planning are critical to amplify the impact of individual initiatives through systemic integration. In this era of rapid change, tracking and monitoring efforts are more crucial than ever. Platforms like UN Habitat's data hubs and the Systems Change Lab offer invaluable insights that empower policymakers, stakeholders, and city leaders to make evidence-based decisions that drive meaningful progress. As we look forward to the upcoming World Urban Forum and the crucial COP29 and COP30 conferences, the steps we take today will profoundly influence the future of our landscapes and ultimately our planet. In conclusion, as we plan for the cities of tomorrow, we must ensure that no one is left behind. Embedding informal settlements in urban planning and all our data initiatives is not just a necessity, it's a moral imperative. It is only through inclusive, forward-thinking strategies that will be able to address the global housing crisis and build cities that are sustainable, equitable, and capable of meeting the needs of all the residents, today and in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this address from Ana Claudia Rosbach, Executive Director of the UN Habitat. We have a great panel ahead of us for discussion, but before we bring them on, we want to really kind of shed some light on city and on the System Change Lab and on the cities and buildings transition and the shifts that are included. So let me take a step back right now before I give the floor to Mev and Emily to kind of really drill into the cities and buildings topics. To limit global temperature rise and to halt biodiversity loss and to build a fairer economy, nearly every major system will need to transform. And that includes how we power our buildings, how we grow food, how we build cities and conserve nature and beyond. And at the same time, these cross-cutting transitions must also occur in political, social, and economic systems. So one does not go without the other. So if we are to create a sustainable and just future, we must navigate with a systems lens. You just already heard from Ana Claudia. So Systems Change Lab was really created in response to the urgent need for these transformational changes. System Change Lab's open source data platform serves as a virtual situation room to showcase research, analysis, and interactive dashboards with data visualizations. It's very interesting that we've identified more than 70 critical shifts across 15 major systems, and you can see them here in the slide projected. And these shifts, they range from planning urban land use to reduce emissions and to create and to increase climate resilience and to extend financial services to the underserved communities, for example. So a lot can be measured and can be analyzed there. And these shifts all together can work together to disrupt the status quo, but also really to create system-wide change. And within each shift that we've identified, System Change Lab measures how much progress have been made toward 2030 and 2050 against the science-based targets, but also look at the enablers and the barriers of systems change that are just as important for getting the job done. So to provide a snapshot of transformational shift related to cities and buildings, we have now kind of two presentations. First one is from Maeve Weston, the Research and Engagement Manager for the Ross Center. And the second is by Emily Daly from New Climate Institute, who looks at the buildings transformation. So I'll now turn over to Maeve first and then to Emily, and then we'll move over to the panel. Maeve, first to you. Please, go ahead.
Thank you, Rohir. I am quickly going to walk through the highlights of our city system. So as we heard in those great opening remarks from Ana Claudia and Rohir, action in cities is vital to protect people, nature, and climate. Cities are currently the source of a large share of greenhouse gas emissions. Over 70% of CO2 equivalent emissions are attributable to cities and the urban activities within them, with urban transport and the building sector among the biggest contributors. And the number of people living in cities is expected to increase by 2.5 billion between 2018 and 2050. But cities are not just one system, they are a system of systems bringing together deeply complex, interconnected networks of people, services, and economic activities. You can see some of those interconnected systems in that image on the slide there. Because of this, the city system is designed to closely link many other systems within the Systems Change Lab, including transport, power, finance, and buildings, which Emily will share a bit more about after this. Within cities, cities being a central hub where there are these systems that they all interconnect, we tried to show through the shifts that we identified that interconnectedness. So our three shifts are plan urban land use to reduce emissions and increase climate resilience, to increase access to resilient and affordable urban services and infrastructure, and improve urban waste management and transition to zero waste cities. Within each shift, there are a series of indicators that help to track progress towards achieving the shift, either directly or indirectly. There are outcome indicators, which have a globally agreed upon target, where we can track progress to achieving that target. Or in some cases, there is no agreed upon target, but we can at least see if we're headed in the right or wrong direction. And you see some examples of what that looks like on the platform on the slide. Many indicators show that there's progress being made in cities, but we are well off track to reach many 2030 goals. And in some instances, we are headed in the wrong direction. The platform also shows enabler and barrier indicators. These indicators do not have a target, but they are important to track because their progress can either help or hurt the progress to achieve those outcome indicators. So you have a few examples of those on the screen, which include the number of cities with climate action plans. There are enablers on finance to cities, on the total housing options that are affordable, and many other that you can see on the platform. I am quickly going to provide an overview of each shift and providing some examples of the type of indicators that you can find on the Systems Change Lab platform. So our first shift, plan urban land use to reduce emissions and increase climate resilience. Many urban areas are rapidly growing, and urban land area could triple between 2015 and 2050, with cities expanding into biodiverse areas and natural habitats. However, urban land use planning, especially when informed by data on climate risks, can help reduce pollution and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and plan for cities that are more compact with more mixed use, build for resilience to climate hazards like heat and flooding. One indicator in this system is land consumption per person. It measures how much land is used per person. And between 2000 and 2015, the global average land consumption per person in urban areas increased. However, between 2015 and 2020, we did see that decrease slightly. Over time, for more sustainable growth in cities, we would ideally like to see land consumption per person decrease or at least remain level. Our second shift within the city system is to increase access to resilient, affordable urban services and infrastructure. So over 1 billion people do not have reliable, safe, or affordable access to basic everyday services like running water, sanitation, electricity, decent housing, or transportation to school and to work. Many of our outcome indicators in this shift are well off track. For example, as of 2022, just a little under 19% of the world's population did not have access to safely managed drinking water. In order to reach the Sustainable Development Goal, which would be for everyone to have access to drinking water, progress needs to be made in urban areas 10 times faster than the recent trends. We see very similar urgency in the indicators on access to sanitation, to energy, to transportation, and to clean cooking. Our third shift is to improve waste management and transition to zero waste cities. The world's cities produce 2.1 billion tons of municipal waste as of 2023, and this is expected to increase to 3.8 billion tons by 2050. And in low and middle income countries, over 90% of solid waste collected from cities is disposed of improperly, which can lead to pollution, land, water pollution, and unchecked methane emissions. But achieving zero waste outcomes in cities provides benefits at the local, regional, and global levels with cleaner streets, reduced pollution, and economic benefits from reduced methane emissions. Mainstreaming methane capture from urban waste is a visible ambition for COP29. So the launch of this system and the inclusion of this urban waste shift is especially vital at this time. Cities have a great opportunity to decarbonize, to reduce polluting emissions, increase resilience, and improve equity, given the growing concentrations of both people and services in urban areas. But our data shows that we are off track on many indicators, and there is still a lot of work to be done. There are also important data gaps to fill to steer action towards these shifts and in line with the targets discussed here. I am now going to pass it over to Emily Daly of the New Climate Institute, who's going to share some of the themes, highlights, and findings from our building system.
Thanks, Maeve, and hi, everyone. As Maeve said, cities are a system of systems, and buildings are a major component of cities. For people around the world, buildings are an important space where we live, work, and carry out many of the activities of our daily lives. Constructing and operating buildings connects a wide range of systems, including the manufacturing and transportation of materials to build them, the electricity to power them, the energy to heat and cool them, and, of course, their relationship to the surrounding environment. Currently, buildings are a significant source of emissions, and their operation contributes approximately 18% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Pathways for decarbonization will vary widely. The building sector is very diverse, and there's no single one-size-fits-all solution. In some climate zones, heating or cooling will be more important, and options will be restricted by the availability of certain types of technologies or existing connections to the grid, for example. In some places, decarbonizing buildings means replacing gas boilers with heat pumps, while in others, it means decarbonizing power to reduce emissions from increased electricity consumption for cooling. So, where do emissions from buildings come from? Some are direct emissions, meaning that they are released from burning fuel for cooking and for heating, or from refrigerants from cooling devices and equipment, and this happens on site. But the majority of buildings' emissions are indirect, meaning that they are released off-site from the production of electricity and heat. Floor area is a key driver of these emissions and an important variable because more floor area generally means more energy consumption and emissions. But growing floor area and energy consumption are also really important and necessary parts of development. The total global floor area of buildings is expected to double from 2020 to 2050, which is crucial to ensuring people's fundamental human right of access to adequate housing. Currently, floor area is highly unequally distributed, with floor area per capita very high in some countries in comparison to others. So reducing demand for floor space and energy and using existing space in different ways can help to rebalance this distribution and improve energy efficiency. Decarbonizing buildings relies heavily on the decarbonization of other sectors, as we've mentioned. This includes power and industry and transport and cities. But action is also needed within the building system. And so for this, we identify 3 shifts. The first shift is constructing zero carbon buildings, and this is about tackling embodied emissions and focuses on building design, material production, and construction and demolition. The construction of new buildings contributed around 10% of global CO2 emissions in 2022. By looking at embodied emissions, the reuse and recycling of materials, the average lifetime of buildings, we can better understand these emissions, their connections to other systems, and how we can work to reduce them. Many actors involved in the construction and operation of buildings can also help with reducing embodied emissions. This means architects and engineers during the design phase, property owners and manufacturers, as well as governments and companies in the procurement phase, and developers and construction companies at the construction and demolition phases. So moving from the physical structure of buildings to how we exist within them, the second shift tackles energy consumption by optimizing energy use through efficiency and reducing energy demand from buildings through behavior change, design, and more efficient appliances. Space heating and cooling are major sources of energy consumption, but buildings also need energy for water heating, lighting, cooking, and using appliances and electronics. We look at the energy intensity of building operations and the retrofitting rate of buildings as our key target indicators. The global energy intensity of building operations has been slowly decreasing in recent years, as you can see in this figure, as a result of reduced energy demand coupled with a growth in floor area. However, this progress needs to accelerate by 3 times in order to meet our 2030 targets. Improving building retrofitting rates and increasing the global sales of energy-efficient building components and appliances will require concerted efforts by governments, investors, industry, and local civil society and business leaders. So reducing energy demand will make it easier to achieve our third shift, which is to decarbonize the remaining energy that is used in buildings. To do this, we need to ensure that every energy service is electrified as much as possible and using the most efficient appliances and equipment. And then that the remaining electricity that is used is coming from zero carbon sources. We track progress on new buildings that are zero carbon, those with on-site renewables, as well as the share of renewables in district heating, the number of installed heat pumps globally, as well as the carbon intensity of building operations. Carbon intensity is heading in the right direction, but progress needs to accelerate in order to stay in line with global temperature goals. The technologies we need for this already exist and are fairly mature. For instance, energy efficient electric heat pumps have become a key technology for decarbonizing space and water heating by replacing fossil fuel-based equipment such as gas boilers, particularly in the global north. So yeah, that's a brief overview of our building system. Thank you for listening, and you can visit the System Change Lab data platform if you're interested in diving deeper into these insights from the buildings and cities systems. With that, I will turn back over to Roger for the panel discussion.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you, Maeve. And please, everyone, don't hesitate to look at the data platform. I mean, this is the launch of the cities and the buildings system. It's very exciting to see the three shifts of the cities and the buildings system presented by you, and the opportunities, but also the enormous challenges that we're still facing ahead of us. So it's very urgent to kind of address them. And I have a great panel that helps us with some insight on how to do it or what challenges we actually need to overcome. I have four great speakers, and just for everybody who's listening right now, please, for any questions in the end of the last 20 minutes of the conversation, we will definitely address your questions, put them in the Q&A. But I first go to our panel, and we have a distinguished Alok Barnwal. Thank you very much for joining. You've just coming back from COP16, looking at the nature and biodiversity angle of cities. You're currently leading the urban and infrastructure team within the GEF, the Global Environmental Facility, and that's part of the Integration and Knowledge Management Division. And you have been a champion on nature-positive, carbon-neutral, and resilient and inclusive approaches within urban and infrastructure system. You also manage the GEF Sustainable Cities platform, Urban Shift, which we're proudly partner of, which has established a platform for knowledge and partnerships. Thank you for being here. Christina, welcome. Christina Gamboa, CEO of the World Green Building Council. You're leading the world's largest and most influential action network on buildings, very much connecting the local to the regional to the global, and spearheading the sustainable transformation to decarbonized and resilient built environments for everyone everywhere. You're a leading voice within the Building to COP Coalition, and you continue to play a pivotal role in championing globally the built environment, not only as a climate imperative, but also key to driving resilient communities and equitable spaces for everyone. Thanks for doing that. You're a leader, a thought leader in this space. Good to have you here. And then Gregor, my God, you've been 3 terms mayor of Vancouver, and not unsuccessfully. But now you are the global ambassador of the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy. Many of you know that as a GCOM, who helps over 13,000 cities to tackle climate and energy challenges. As I said, you served 3 terms as a Vancouver mayor, and under your leadership, Vancouver transformed into one of the greenest, most livable cities in the world, and has now the smallest carbon footprint per person of North America. So something to be proud of. Thanks, Gregor, for doing that. And thanks for being a champ of CHAMP, which is the Coalition of Higher Ambition Multi-Level Partnerships. And we hopefully hear more about that later in our conversation. And last but not least, and for everybody who's listening in from India, happy Diwali. There's a lot of crackers being behind you, I heard, Harini. So thanks for being here during the festivities in your country. You're the director of the School of Climate Change and Sustainability and the director of the Research Center at Azim Premji University in Bangalore in India. And you're known for your research on forest conservation and urban sustainability. As a professor, you have written over 200, everybody listen well, 200 academic papers, and you are on Stanford's list of the top 2% cited scientists in the world. Not a lot of people can claim that. So you've also been lead author on the IPCC 5th Assessment Report, and you sit on a number of boards and steering committee, and I'm, of course, very proud. We are very proud that you are part of the advisory group of the Ross Center. So thank you for joining us today in the panel discussion around the launch of the Cities and Buildings Systems Change Lab. And I first have one question for all of you, and then I dive in more specifically in a more specific question for each of you. But one question that I want to ask all of you, and I start with Alok, and then Christina, Gregor, and Harini. I mean, you've heard Maeve and Emily explaining where are the opportunities, but also the challenges if you look at the data. And how might this work, the System Change Lab work, actually support efforts in your organization together with partners to achieve systems level change in cities? Can you help us with reflecting on this question? Kicking off with you, Alok.
Thank you so much, Roger. And yes, happy World Cities Day to all, and also happy Diwali for people who are listening from India or celebrating elsewhere in the world. First, I'd like to thank the System Change Lab at WRI for inviting me to this very important conversation on urban system, and also congratulate on this launch of the cities and building system. I would like to start by saying that the shifts which are identified by the lab aligns very strongly with the Jeff's approach in the Sustainable Cities Integrated Program. Our rationale for cities program is basically shifting from isolated sectoral interventions to supporting integrated approaches that address the systemic drivers of environmental degradation and vulnerability in urban areas. And I think the systems, the data and all actually alludes to that, and is something that will directly complement our work. We work at the system scale, and we all know working at system scale is very complex. It's not easy. And cities are systems of systems, as Maeve said at the beginning. So it's very important that a deeper understanding of different dimensions of transformational change, the metric to track this change, is needed. And also it's for understanding, and it ultimately supports and resource mobilization. And we come we are an environment financing mechanism, and we care about global environmental benefits, and the system and the indicators I see are directly tracking those. So if we can draw on from there, it can help us understand how environmental benefits are achieved, and then accordingly the financing and other support can be provided. So overall, it's quite enabling. Let me try to respond to the three shifts which were presented, which are the key highlights or dimensions of transformation that the System Change Lab has identified. And I would like to deliberate on that, comparing with three key transformation pillars which the Jeff follows in its cities-based program. So, the definition of transformation varies, right? And it depends on from where you're coming from, but ultimately it's about nature positivity, neutrality, sustainability, and resilience of cities. But the transformation pillars that we have identified vary slightly differently from what has been identified by the lab, but it overlaps and it is quite complementary. So let me start by presenting the three pillars that we have and how it complements. So first pillar is nature, and the second is on circularity, and the third is on decarbonization and resiliency of urban infrastructure. So these are the three broader transformation pillars we are working with. And let me quickly share how this complements the work that System Change Lab is doing. So on the nature, we had an informal conversation before we started the webinar. I was at Cali last week for CBD COP, and it clearly highlighted that cities are so important in achieving global biodiversity goals. It established that cities are not just economic centers, but vital ecosystem zones. And towards the end, the discussions on cities converged to the fact that biodiversity is not only important in global biodiversity hotspots, but also in cities, and their action is a crucial part of the equation of protecting the planet. So that's clearly firmed up in the COP. Additionally, enhancing natural features and biodiversity in cities is crucial for future sustainability of cities in tackling challenges such as depleting water tables, floodings, heat waves, land degradation, water pollution, air pollution, and greenhouse gas emissions. So it's clear that nature must be an integral, must be an essential urban asset and public service to ensure delivery of basic urban services and its growth. So, in short, the transition from purely gray to nature-driven urban growth is vital. Cities need to change from the drivers of nature loss to become key actors and spaces to protect and build with nature. And I heard from several mayors. We have one champion mayor in our panel today, so I don't need to say, how the leadership is emerging. So coming to the point, it's that in our cities program, it is therefore an essential part, and I strongly believe that the global momentum and our work aligns very well with the shift related to the first shift on land use and access to urban services, under which I think nature is an integral part, and tracking of these indicators, targets would be very helpful. Coming to the circularity aspect, and I'll try to be quick. The rising population, urbanization, is putting a lot of pressure on resources. I remember there was a Weight of Cities report published a few years back, which clearly said that the demand for raw materials will far exceed what the planet can sustainably provide, and it will affect, loss of resources, high level of greenhouse gas emissions, and pollution. So these are the things Jeff works on, and that's why circularity is a core theme of our work. And I think the systemic shift on waste, on zero waste cities, kind of links with the circularity approach or priority for us. So I see again an important alignment. And the final dimension on decarbonization and resiliency, and I think this is also quite obvious in the three shifts that have been presented today. And what we have seen is that the momentum on this particular aspect has been relatively better in last 10 years compared to nature, primarily driven by economies of scale, business viability, innovation. However, I think there are still few issues which needs to be factored in for transformation. There are still perverse incentives in cities that encourage carbon-intensive infrastructure and land use. We heard that land use per capita is increasing, and it's because the incentives are better for more land use. The second is that the effort to decarbonize remains siloed and sectoral. And finally, climate resilience, even though it is a public policy priority, it often takes backseat because the economic case and financing is limited. So on these aspects, action is needed, and I'm sure that the tracking of different progress, barriers, targets by the Systems Change Lab can inform future financing and incremental financing by the Jeff. So I just wanted to present how the transformation shifts aligns with the pillars that we have, and I think the complementarity I see is that we have a global function responding to global conventions and meeting global targets. The shifts identified by the lab is anchored on local action and local insights, so it is highly complementary. And we will begin our Jeff 9 replenishment from next year and develop our programming strategy. And we are really looking forward to drawing more specific insights from the lab's work and also inform its work to make it more robust. So I hope that responds to the question, Rogier, and back to you.
That definitely does unlock. And also, I mean, I'm almost inclined to ask a lot of other questions, but I hope we can first kind of go around the panel, and maybe we can get some topics that you kind of elevated to the forefront and discuss further. But it's very good to hear the alignment, of course, and the necessity to track progress, especially because you're leading on the biggest cities grant mechanism in the world, which kind of funds projects on the ground in the countries, in the cities, and at the same time funds a global capacity building platform, urban shift. So thanks for doing that. Thanks for your reflection. Now I want to go over, I want to move on to Christina, responding to the same questions. How might this work support you and your organization and the partners in achieving system levels change? Go ahead, Christina.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And really exciting. Congratulations again on the launch. It's really fantastic. Yes, well done. You know, we all celebrate each other when, as partners in this journey with shared values and purpose. It's really great. I'm really happy and it's an honor to be here. So quick, I think, you know, from the World Green Building Council, we've spent over 22 years building up a network of green building councils around the world, which are hubs of bringing the full value chain to work together locally. And where we are at this moment, I think the Systems Lab perspective aligns quite a lot with what we're right now endeavoring to do in the next 3 years. Basically, I think the key, you know, serendipity of the moment is as you map out those indicators. I was also seeing a little block in the corner saying S-curve, maybe not happening. This maybe not happening. And I think all those like tracking of where are we and where are the trends and bringing out that information together will make it easier for the industry that needs to collaborate with each other to deliver on changing those trajectories, to make sure that we can continue to build on what is being successful, correct course, and make sure that we make the transition inevitable. For us at World GBC, we believe firmly that data-driven policies will dramatically enable changing the landscape. And this sort of information that you're putting forward, as Alok was saying, of course, it will inform JEF funds, but it also will inform sustainable finance trends, right? I think there's also some silver linings in sustainable finance that eventually we could track and add on. There's also for us at World GBC, and we've partnered with WRI in some of these, and the roadmaps of decarbonization, which start by the private sector saying, what are we ready to do today? How can we partner better with governments? How can we have an enabling policy environment? I believe the sort of data-driven systems thinking will be enabling all of us to engage better with politicians at a local level to advocate for those enabling policy environments for systemic improvement. Because it is through public procurement in cities that we will deliver on those local green materials. It is through energy efficiency, coherence, and performance, mandating disclosure of energy audits, having data-driven approaches to making sure that the appliances have all the credentials that we need, etc. I think building on what you've put out, I'm very excited because it gives us more hooks and more things to do in the network that we mobilize, which includes 46,000 companies globally. And if we can partner up and do that better, I think we have a chance in truly making this inevitable.
Thank you so much, Christina. 46,000 companies, wow. I mean, and I do really appreciate your reflections and the complexity of system. I think we all agree, and many of us here in the audience is on this systems approach, but how to do it right and how to get the data in place to kind of track progress on where we actually act upon. I think that's the next level, and that's what System Change Lab with these transitions try to highlight and try to help us with. Gregor, same question for you. How will this help you to achieve systems level in the work that you're currently conducting?
Well, thanks, Rohir, and happy Diwali, happy Halloween to everyone. Honored to be joining us, all of us here today, talking on this critical topic. And so big thanks to WRI and the Systems Change Lab team for hosting and launching this important work. We, the broader context here, I think we all see this. We're losing the battle to prevent climate and nature breakdown. And the way to turn that around is by taking action, but that action has to be informed by the best science, by the best practice that we know. So this platform, this research certainly can boost the global efforts and the actions on the ground that we need to take. And I think in my case, I'm currently the special envoy for cities in CHAMP, and the CHAMP initiative is all about partnerships between all levels of government for climate action. So 74 countries committed to the CHAMP initiative last year in Dubai at COP28, and they committed to work with cities, states, and regions to accelerate climate action on the ground. So that's the bottom line with CHAMP. Those partnerships have to deliver more results. I think what we see in the Systems Change Lab platform is we're on the wrong track. Most of those indicators, unfortunately, show us we're losing this battle, and we have to turn things around here. So I would say the piece that many of us are working on the government side is around collaboration and partnership. That the missing link in terms of delivery is that national governments are going out and acknowledging with the Paris Agreement, we all need to focus on decarbonizing, we all need to focus on adaptation. We have limited number of years left to do this, to keep our people and our planet safe. And we need to see that action rolled out. Unfortunately, the action is not rolling out on the ground because cities do not have the financing, do not have the jurisdiction to take action. So there's a bigger scale problem here that somehow we need to wrap our hands around to ensure that all levels of government are working together in partnership to deliver the results on the ground. And particularly in cities where, as was said, the vast majority of the pollution, the climate pollution, is coming from cities. Those are the northern cities generally. So the global south cities need an enormous amount of help to prevent becoming giant climate polluters as well, and have large populations and urbanization and informal settlements. That has to change dramatically. So those cities don't turn into the cities that we've already built in the north that we now have to transform and decarbonize, which is a big, big challenge. So these partnerships, CHAMP is really about bringing national governments and cities, states, and regions together to make sure the planning is worked, integrated together. All of the national plans on climate, the NDCs, the biodiversity plans, the adaptation plans include urban content and basically pull from the best practices and the data that are now on this platform. So we've got plug and play from this platform to put into those national plans. And then it's about implementation and financing. So it's fantastic to hear Alok talk about the Jeff being aligned with these priorities, because the financing piece is absolutely critical for cities. I just think we've got so much work in front of us, but these are important milestones to get the clear priorities laid out so we can take action.
Thank you so much, Gregor, for this very clear view on especially on the multi-level governance or the collaboration between local and national, and the importance of urban content in national action plans and how everything sits together. Of course, great to hear that the Jeff is aligned, but we cannot put it all on the shoulders of Alok and the Jeff to finance the transition, right? That's absolutely not going to work. So I think what Christina also said is that really that this data can help us to make much better collaborations across sectors to kind of get the work done and also get the finance in place to subnationals and cities. For everybody who's listening right now, and you are with many, we have a whole team looking at your questions, and I will address them after the panel. So don't worry, just stay on. Over to you, Harini. I mean, this is your bread and butter, right? You are driving evidence, you are doing the academic research with your teams. Can you tell us something, what does this mean to you and to your work in your workspace?
Sure. It's been very fascinating to listen. And again, apologies, there are crackers and bombs bursting behind me. You might hear this noise fading in and out. So I'm going to respond from the perspective of a research organization, particularly one based in a rapidly urbanizing global south country, in fact, the world's most populous country now, right? India. And it's been very interesting to listen to the panelists talk about very important challenges, which is no data, no finance, no jurisdictional capacity for cities. But also there's another very important challenge that I'd like to point to, which is where academic institutions play a role, which is that we don't have trained manpower. And since global cities are growing so fast, we are data poor and we're resource poor, but we're also very low on trained human capacity. And data sets are very useful, but data sets are especially useful for an academic institution in fostering new ways of thinking, especially data sets that are built with an explicit systemic focus, right? Unless you have that systemic focus within the systems transformation focus, you just have little bits and pieces that students don't know how to connect to each other. So that's, I think, the first thing, the fact that all of these data sets, even when you have, and I love the fact that you have a lot of places where you have a drop-down menu and you say data isn't available yet, but you've identified that this is a very important piece of the puzzle. Whereas many data sets just say, here's what we have and go with that. The second thing I'd like to respond to, I'm really happy to hear, for instance, Alok say that when he went to Kali, there was a lot of discussion about the importance of cities for the CBD. As someone who's been, doing this for 30 plus years, I remember earlier discussions with Diversitas and with CBD monitoring after, when we were running up to the 10 years after the convention, looking at how do you monitor them. And there were maybe one or two of us saying cities are relevant to this issue. In IPCC, I remember in the AR5 looking at whether nature in cities could play a role in mitigation of climate change. And most people thought no. And in fact, the mitigation section on nature was actually taken out of the chapter. So a lot has changed. I think data sets of this kind have helped to make that shift. Our own research, for instance, shows that more than 40% of Indian cities are now less than an hour's drive from more than 40% of India's protected areas are less than an hour's drive from a city, which means India has to rethink its entire conservation strategy to factor in urbanization, right? And then you add climate change on top of that, and species are going to shift boundaries. And this is not India alone. This is going to be all countries, especially all global south tropical countries. So we need to train a new generation of thinkers in how to grapple with this very complex, wicked challenges, systems of systems challenges. And one of the things we have been seeing at Azim Premji University in the School of Climate Change and Sustainability, which I founded, is that it's important not just to think of students as young people coming into undergraduate, masters, PhDs, but also to think of working professionals. We find that journalists really want to cover this in a very in-depth way, but lack the capacity, don't know the data sets, don't know where they should go. And again, an explicit systems guidance can be very useful. For instance, policymakers similarly want to play around with data. Architects, they want to get into some of these. And where are you going to find a data set of this kind that architects can use to understand how to think about buildings? So I think there are a lot of ways in which this data set allows you to address many challenging questions. I'll end with 2-3 things that I think are especially useful for this kind of a data set. The first is that it's interactive and exploratory. Of course, you have wonderful reports published every year, but they're static tables. This is updated and it lets you pull in pieces. For instance, how do you integrate justice and equity? How do you integrate biodiversity and emissions? These are important issues, and most data sets are not going to allow you to do that. But again, from the educational point of view, it's especially critical, I think, because it fosters a different way of thinking, and that's what Global South cities, all kinds of cities actually, not just Global South cities, but we really need this capacity built in working professionals as well as young people entering the workplace. And the last becomes the fact, the behavioral aspect. I think one of the things we often discuss while we're in WRI meetings is that we need to broaden our discussions. We're always speaking to the choir. How do you reach influential audiences easily without using nuance? I think interactive data sets are very, very useful to reduce the behavioral barrier. People like playing with a graph. You pull something down, something else pops up. It's a very gamified sort of a landscape, and it pulls people in, lets them explore, lets them understand. And I think something like this would be really important to broaden the horizon and get many more people in. So I think educational institutions is something that I would love to see across the world working with these data sets, really.
Thank you so much, Hareen. And I think your view on playing around with data to understand, how you as a professional or as a journalist can use it kind of either to bring the narrative across or either to understand how you in your profession can make an impact. It's very important that systems change lab data is not static. And as you see, it identifies also where the gaps are and where the data is not yet available. Also something for researchers to contribute to where possible. So thanks for highlighting that. So I want to now ask you more specific questions, each of you, before we go to the audience. And to you, starting with you, Alok, can you share some views on how you think that we can ensure greater uptake of the data and the insights available on Systems Change Lab to inform decision-making in more cities and to scale the shifts we just heard about? So that uptake is extremely important. Can you share some of your views?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for this question. And I think Harini already responded to this to quite a great extent. I would first like to start by saying that how this data is so relevant to institutions like us, which takes integrated approaches, working across sectors, across government levels, engaging the private sector, the communities, and looking at climate, biodiversity, land degradation, pollution in a very coherent manner. Because in a system of systems, we cannot really take siloed approaches, and the data sets and the insights and the barriers I see are quite well placed to inform such integrated approaches. And it would be useful to know going forward how the different data sets that you have interact with each other, like how they are informing each other. I know they are probably independent variables, not really maybe mutually exclusive, but I see strong links, like land use versus mobility access and all. So how the data interacts with each other, and would be very useful to inform the integrated approach or systems approach that we are doing. It's relevant, but it would be useful to know more going forward. Now, how to how to ensure greater uptake? I would say, and again, this is building on what Harini said, is that when we think of decision making on sustainability, we often think of decision making at the political level, right? By the mayors or by the subnational governments or national governments or big investors. But if you see in reality, the decision making and transformation process starts at the very bottom, like with the communities. If they understand risks, they know solutions, then they apply behavior change, right? And similarly, a lot of decision making also happens at the technical level, right? The planners, the implementers, the architects, engineers, consultants, and many others who are involved. So, and then to financial institutions, and then it goes up. So I think for a greater uptake, it is really important that the data and insights are packaged in a way that it responds to the needs or the gaps which exist in this entire value chain of urban sustainability or resilience. So that's fundamental. And what we are doing to inform such decision making is we are focusing on 4 transformation levers, which leverages data, science, and insights from various sources. And these are basically focusing on governance and policy coherence in decision making, working at multi-government scale. The second is on leveraging financing from public and private sources for scale. The third is catalyzing innovation across technology, business models, policies, and governance. And finally, facilitating multi-stakeholder dialogues, bringing different actors together, and our platforms like Urban Shift and the Global Platform for Sustainable Cities are playing a crucial role in this. So we would really like to welcome, we look for data and insights, and we would be very keenly looking at the data and insights from the lab and other information to inform these levers, because we think that these are really vital for systems transformation. And also these are avenues through which the uptake of the data can be scaled up by embedding it in the financing, by embedding in the innovations, by embedding in dialogues and policies. So and at the Jeff side, Rogier, you mentioned earlier that I'm now part of the integration and knowledge management team, which is a new team in the Jeff, which highlights the importance of lessons and knowledge. And, building on our experience of working across nearly 100 cities now, and through our partners like WRI, Clean C40, probably thousands of cities, we are keen to share the lessons from our experience also and feed it back to the city, to the lab's work to ensure that the uptake is even greater. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Alok. And there were actually two questions, also great reflection. And maybe Maeve and Emily, or maybe Anjali on the back a little later can address them, especially on how does Systems Change Lab look at system interactions. So maybe we can hear a little bit about that. Not now, you can think about it. And also the data and insights, right? You say this kind of packaged way of bringing actually the analytics to the data and to the specific policy domains where it's needed. So we'll address that a little later, because there are some questions I think in the chat that also reflect or kind of relate to that. Christina, I want to go to you first, because we heard in the beginning, we heard Ana Claudia, Executive Director UN Habitat, talk about informal settlements and how important it is to address them as part of the data, as part of the formal planning. So how do you look at the green building movement? How can informal settlers, and disenfranchised communities actually gain from this kind of climate resilient and energy efficient buildings approach? I mean, many of them not having a building, many of them, are challenged with land issues, for example. Can you reflect a little bit on that?
Yes. Thank you for addressing that question to me. It goes straight to my heart. I am from Colombia, and so I do have a good view of what emerging cities are dealing with, and cities that have been over 50% built informally, and what really does that mean. So I would say, of course, the green building movement has to be acting with consideration and compassion to the different levels of economic development and capacities. Let's say the Systems Lab gives us an insight, right? A rough indication of direction, but then you have to go in a regional context, you have to make it locally appropriate. And when you go even deeper, then the informal settlements question is, let's say, the biggest, can we call it a skeleton in what we're dealing with here? Because it's out of the data. When you see the data points, it's out of the data in a way, right? But how can we go about it in a positive way? For sure, our movement can do many things. I would say, for example, as we progress and there's more demand for higher quality buildings that are doing all the great things that you guys described around whole life carbon and better performance and all that, at the end of the day, for people in low income, it matters to have information on better quality materials, so availability of local green materials, that the governments are planning for a resiliency, better drainage. We've just seen it. It's just they deserve at least to have some sort of a water management around where they're building their houses. Of course, we need to empower communities to access that information, and if they're going to improve their homes, that they have access to a way of doing it, to be resilient, to be safe, and of course, if possible, give them access to microcredit, affordable financing, and make sure that the integrated services, and hopefully we help them procure clean energy and renewables, because if they don't have energy access, that's energy poverty. And of course, trying to get communal spaces to be more widely used by the community during the full day. And that goes to what an architect from Colombia calls sustainable acupuncture, social acupuncture. You can build a great school in a very underprivileged community that can be used the full weekend by the full community. So, of course, and then the key thing here is those informal settlements question will take a lot of political determination to tackle. While that comes around, we can be very empathic and considerate to get women in the front lines the information they need to improve their homes in a sustainable way, get the renewable energy closer to them, get them the finance to be able to get it into their homes, and make sure that we at least are getting that closer. And from the World GBC, this is not like an idea out of my head. We have, for example, in Colombia, again, the Cali conversation was here. The Colombia Green Building Council, with this I wrap up, has a rating tool called Casa Colombia, and the Casa means house. And right now, the mayor of Bogota is using it to retrofit informal homes. So they're having that criteria that I'm describing, and then they're taking it on how to improve the quality to make those homes resilient and better in terms of saving water and energy and leaving more money available for people to thrive and improve the quality. So I think there's definitely something there, but it will take a lot of determination and work from the heart, because there's really not a business case for the private sector that is in another area to be working on resiliency and sustainability in informal homes.
Thanks a lot, Christina. Thanks for highlighting the political determination that's needed. We need to be careful that the informal housing challenge in rapidly growing cities is not only considered a technical problem, it's a political challenge that needs to be addressed. And the data can help, as you say, to kind of mobilize different groups, including women, to kind of address it. You also mentioned kind of resilient services. I mean, if we talk about housing, we need to make sure that it lands well in a service community, which is kind of key for providing opportunities and a better life for all. Over to you, Gregor. Talking about changing cities and talking about innovation. You've been a city leader for a long time. There's so many great examples, but there's also so much need to share them across cities. And we, with the Ross Center, you always have the excuse, this city is so different than the other cities. It's very difficult to exchange and replicate. Can you share a little bit on your experience? How do you make cities learn from each other and replicate the best interventions based on evidence planning?
Well, it's a great question. I think there's a ton of exchange happening between cities, and WRI's Ross Center for Cities does amazing work at this. Networks like Global Covenant of Mayors, C40, ICLEI, we've got an enormous array of networks that connect cities and make sure that at a technical level, there is connection and support between cities. Cities love to steal ideas from each other. And we don't really compete head to head in terms of being successful. So mayors love talking to each other, staff at all levels. I think that the more connectivity that we have, the better. So those networks are strong. I think the networks that need to be stronger, as mentioned before, around the CHAMP initiative, are the connections between national governments and the cities, states, and regions, and making sure that collaboration. And when I was in Cali last week, that I think the phrase was radical collaboration that came up around cities and nature, where we have to break through the current barriers and have collaboration happening between levels of government that has not existed before. We can do a lot on the ground within our cities around innovation and making sure we achieve these breakthroughs. And we've seen extraordinary success and breakthroughs from entrepreneurs all over the world, and some of that at the convergence of climate, nature, and the digital world. In Vancouver, we launched a program called the Green and Digital Demonstration Program, which provided clean tech and digital entrepreneurs with access to city-owned infrastructure, assets for proof of concept trials and pilot testing. So it was basically giving our entrepreneurs an opportunity to contribute to the city, to leverage the opportunity in our city. And in many cases, we had technology that was proved, tested, and then was able to scale into other cities. So I think cities can do a lot with the entrepreneurs that we have within. We also have, and going to Harini's point earlier about we have to train this new workforce. We don't have the capacity around the world among the younger generation yet. We had a program in Vancouver called City Studio, which was extraordinarily successful in bringing students into the city to work at the city, earning credit as part of their university or college education. I think we've had over 10,000 students now, over 2,000 projects, hundreds of thousands of student hours focused on co-creating and problem solving and delivering solutions for the city on all sorts of different climate and nature focused, certainly, but extending really across all of the actions, housing and land use, obviously part of that as well. So that was a way of really engaging and empowering students to be part of the city and to see that as part of their responsibility. And I'd say, the larger scale here around political responsibility, we all have in democracies a responsibility to be politically engaged and to keep pressure on and hold elected people accountable to deliver on the innovation, the change, the action on the ground that we need to see. So we all have that political piece that ultimately, hopefully, derives the innovation that we need.
Thanks, Gregor. Really very helpful reflections. Harini, over to you. So, you talked a bit about the gaps and the fact that actually on the pull down we identified the key indicators, but not all of these indicators we have the sufficient data. So how do you, as a research organization, look at the kind of filling these gaps, or what are trajectories to get them filled in order to kind of drive change and innovation, as Gregor said, based on data, on all available data?
So much. I mean, it's such a rich discussion. I think I'll be going back and thinking about this for several months now. There's a lot. We recently wrote a paper in PLOS Climate where we argued that research institutions should be engaged in what we call climate data democracy. And Jeff was talking about democratization of just the production of cities, the planning of cities, the sustainability of cities. And we really need to see how we can do that. That is where data sets of this kind and maybe collaborations with research universities can play a role. Because research universities, I won't say we're free of bias, but relatively free of bias, and more importantly, play a very important role at these multiple levels, locally within the city, but also regionally within a state and within the nation. I think there are 2-3 other aspects that are really important here, and I'll go from a local to a larger scale. Gap filling, obviously you need a lot of local gap filling, and students come, let's say, from all across a country if you have a national level institution, internationally if you have a university that is known internationally. And there you can have a lot of gap filling where students take up projects. I was very, very interested also in the idea that Jeff spoke about with the Vancouver City project, and the word that he used was empowering. One thing I know as someone who's been teaching young people for close to 30 years, we have a very different problem on our hands, which is a very serious problem now. About, let's say, even 10 years ago, when we were teaching young people doing different things about the importance of the environment, some got it, but many didn't. Now you have almost the opposite problem, that they get it too much, and so much that it frightens them. And I think projects like this are very important to empower students, because empowerment comes from action. And when you do something with a city or with a data set, you see that what you've done has value. It can bring about change, maybe at a small level, but you don't feel so hopeless in front of these global forces. So I think that's a really important challenge that we need to tackle. It also helps us harness the creativity of young people, because I think there's so many solutions out there that we just don't see, and we need younger people there. But for that, especially with data, you need a harmonized way of collecting data. And that really becomes challenging. It's not like you don't have data on different cities with different papers and projects. You can't bring it all together because each was done differently using a different scale, different method, time period, sampling strategy, all of that. And so I would say one of the ways such a data set would engage with the outside world would be to come up with methods saying, okay, this is an important gap, but this is how you could fill this important gap. And maybe methods that are not prescriptive, because yes, South and North context will be different. Rich and poor context will be different. In an informal settlement, you can ask some questions. If you go to a large company, you can ask a different set of questions. But some templates, some guidelines, let's say, not a template, but a guideline. Something like that you need. And the other 2 things that I would say is, how do you add the community? How do you make not just research students or researchers that go out and get data, but I think a lot of what people have been talking about is people need to own their data, which means they need to collect their data. And if you're talking about informal settlements who could be valuable custodians of their own data, then you need to have guidelines and training even more. but also have them able to empower themselves by saying, okay, I agree with this, but I'm going to do something slightly different in the context here. One last thing, and is that you need to have a way of also incorporating the humanities and social sciences, because I think often with data, we just focused on numbers because we can measure things. And there's so much about the way in which people live in cities, which is not about numbers, which is about so much more well-being, the way we live life, the importance of nature, for instance, is, we, again, just to a little digression, we were looking at a plan of the state of Kerala, which is an urban employment guarantee scheme. People don't get paid that much money, but one of the things they like the best is to grow things, because they say to grow something, even if I didn't get too much money, yes, it gives me food, but it makes me happy. Just to be growing something makes me positive. And these are, the poorest of the poor, maybe old people who can't work anywhere else, or women who have children with them. So this just, there are many things that we can't measure, and we need to figure out how to get some of those unmeasurable things still onto a platform like this.
Thanks, Harini. I mean, you put the finger on a very important the piece of life, the ability to grow something. Either it's nature or it's your own capabilities, or maybe it's in the end, it's some money, right? It's depending a little bit on where you are. It's very, very, very important. I want to go, thanks for this. I mean, there's so many, as you said, Harini, we can think for quite a few months on topics that have been elevated in this discussion. I want to address a few questions from the audience, a couple of curated questions. Some of them are lumped. I have two that I will share with you, and you can think a little bit. And then I want to go over to May to answer these two questions of Alok on the system interaction and also on how we package some of the insights. But first, I'm going to share the two questions from the chat, and which is, I think the first one is very relevant for the upcoming World Urban Forum, especially for the COP, which is resonating already for a long time, which is around loss and damage. How can the insights from this data support developing cities and countries in particular? So they have not been historic carbon polluters. They face big governance gaps, sometimes corruption in some cases, fewer resources and institutional capacity. So what are the most effective approaches for these areas, and how can they use the opportunity of their NDC revision to raise ambition? It's a very big question. So I give you some minutes to think about it, and you're all being part of this conversation for quite a bit. Another question, very, very important, as we see enormous water challenges across the world. City water systems account for a large amount of energy and carbon output, and they're also under threat from climate change. Yet water is often set aside in its own silo. How can water systems be part of the urban transition too? So maybe you can just give these give these two questions a bit of thought. But I first now want to go to Maeve to answer these questions of Alok on how do we play around with the interaction of the systems and how we package insights for a wider audience or specific political objectives.
Yes, thank you, Alok, for the questions. I'm going to try and answer that question, as well as some of the questions we're getting in the chat about whether or not there's a breakdown to city level data, since some of these answers are connected. So on the cross-cutting nature of the Systems Change Lab, how do they interact? One of the ways that we've done that is that there are indicators that are shared between systems. So we've identified in the city system some indicators that are also important to track progress in the transport system. You'll see those indicators located in both locations in order to show that connection between systems. You also are able to use a filter on the platform that allows you to compare results between and to be able to see those graphs and the progress between different indicators to assess progress. So you're able to manually look at some of that interaction there. In addition to that, the Systems Change Lab, through this research, has started to identify and see those links where the interactions exist. And the research team is working on analysis that will dive deeper into those connections between the systems and will be rolled out in the coming years. So that's a bit about the interaction. And the answer about city level data. So the city system does not show city level data. And part of that reason is also because of that interaction. So we want to consistently track the data across these different sectors. And in order to do that, we've done it at the global and the national level across all of those sectors, as Rohir showed. I don't know off the top of my head, but how many systems we have on the Systems Change Lab there besides cities and buildings, but those finance ones, water, food, all of the other indicators as well. We want to be able to show that interaction at the global and the national level.
Thanks, Maeve. Emily, you want to come in? Emily from New Climate Institute.
Yeah, sure. I think Maeve covered it pretty well. But I was also just going to say that I think the bread and butter of Systems Change Lab is kind of taking the systems perspective, both within each system, but then between them, and looking a bit at the web of relationships, actions, key actors. So yeah, I think Maeve covered it quite well.
Thanks, Maeve. Thanks, Emily. So back to the panel right now on this kind of two kind of major questions. One is how the from the Data Lab actually can support developing cities and countries to raise ambitions and use the next iteration of the NDCs. And for the ones that don't know this lingo yet, NDCs are nationally determined contributions, and they have to be resubmitted. These are the climate action plans of countries. They have to be resubmitted before the COP in Belém 2025. So we'll probably see them coming in at a rolling basis from the beginning of 2025. And these are supposed to kind of raise ambition and how these insights can help developing countries and developing cities. And maybe Harini, I don't know who wants to go first, but maybe I can ask Harini to kind of reflect a bit on this, and then maybe one other panelist to kind of to answer, and Gregor. Harini, go ahead.
I mean, one of the things is I think it will be hard, but for NDCs, it is important to understand where are the hardest things to hit and the lowest hanging fruit. And I think if a data set like this could just tell us that, for instance, maybe decarbonization of buildings is one thing that we should be looking at. Maybe you could look at something that has multiple benefits, like instead of painting your roofs white, you grow something on your roof and you get food, you get local miles, you get nutrition, you get you reduce the air conditioning costs of buildings. So something like that. What are the possibilities? What are the lowest hanging fruit, and what's going to be the hardest to hit? And I think that to me is one of the straight away the uses. But I also think it would be useful. I know I can see that there's a reason why you haven't done this at the city level and want to stay at the national and international levels. But if you had a few cities as examples, I think people would understand how to use something like this, because I think people are going to come back to these questions. So think of a few example regions, have just some cities which are data rich. The challenge will be to make sure that they're not all global north cities if you want data. But I think a few of this something would be useful.
No, very, very helpful, very practical also, Harini. What's the hardest hit, and what is the lowest hanging fruit, and what are some examples on how to apply this and use this for raising ambitions? Thanks, Harini, for your answer. Gregor, I saw your hand up for kind of chiming in on this.
Yeah, well, it's I think a really important question. In previous years, coming out of Paris, when the whole design of this system with nationally determined contributions, which, it's a really cryptic way of saying national climate plans, but they're called NDCs. They've never really had much scrutiny or accountability or transparency. So the good news is that looks to be changing. The CHAMP initiative and many other sectors right now are putting pressure on the national governments to say, you need to engage and involve the cities, particularly in your national climate plans. The cities are going to deliver the results on the ground. And what we found, UN Habitat's research found that only about a quarter of the NDCs to date have had strong urban content. So they've just been completely missing the boat. So with the new 5-year national climate plans, because these are 2025 to 2030 in this pivotal decade, we all need to be watching. We all need to be asking the questions and tracking what the countries are bringing forward in their plans. And I think this is where Systems Change Lab and even more so what Harini's mentioning there about the low-hanging fruit, the most critical indicators and data, how do those match from the local level right up to those national climate plans and NDCs? I think we've got to connect the dots here, but this systems type approach gives us an opportunity in a very complex landscape to really laser in on the most critical pieces that need to be included in the plans, and then they need to be actioned. We need to track that.
Thanks, Gregor. I see your hand, Christina. You want to chime in?
Yes, I wanted to add because World GBC is working on a project called an NDC scorecard. It looks at buildings, not the city project, but precisely as Gregor was saying, we're on it and we're putting pressure in a positive way, meaning that we're doing workshops in 5 emerging markets, Egypt, Nigeria, Philippines, Colombia, and Brazil, challenging what they are currently having as commitment in the NDC and buildings, because without urban ambition in NDCs, we won't get to 1.5. And so we know that 161 countries mention buildings, but it hasn't led to much. So we can collaborate with the Systems Lab on this, because the idea is to facilitate that gap analysis, test it locally, and make sure that the national policies and implementation are aligned so the commitments are actually put into practice. And it's a great opportunity because the workshops and everything locally make people also realize that it's doable. It's what citizens will benefit from, and what politicians can also benefit from, savings on future infrastructure needs and things like that. So there's an excellent case to partner up there, and as we call the campaign, to be bold on buildings and make sure that we're building this transition with the NDC conversation too.
Thanks, Christina. Any inputs from your end? Alok, go ahead.
Yeah, just to complement what Gregor mentioned about, this CHAMP initiative linking local city plans with NDCs. When I was at Kali, I heard from several cities developing their LBSAPs, like local biodiversity strategy action plans, which contributes to the NBSAPs, which is the National Strategies on Biodiversity. So there is a global momentum built around taking this whole of government and whole of society approaches to achieve these global goals, and cities are increasingly being a very strong part of it. In fact, as you know, the GEF financing or any multilateral financing that goes to countries goes through national governments. So, having a dedicated cities program itself is a push to engage local governments directly in achieving global environmental goals. So there is a trend there, and I think it's happening, and the individual who asked this question is spot on and probably can engage in these conversations. I would like to also respond to the second question, which was on water.
Yeah, please go ahead.
I would say that water is quite an integral part of the systems-based approaches, particularly if you look at nature-based solutions or urban nature aspect. It is the most important resource or public service that is being addressed, like both from improving resilience from flooding, as well as improving resilience to depleting water tables, and how to restore water bodies for improving ecosystem services and for enhancing biodiversity in cities. So it may not have come out so explicitly in our transformation levers or in the shifts, but I like to say that it is quite integral. It is so integral that probably doesn't require a separate classification or tagging. So
Thanks a lot, but maybe one or two of you can respond to it. I know we are getting to almost to the end of this conversation, but the water challenge is really severe right now, right? So I mean, just to mention, if you think, Gregor, I know that you're at the moment in Quito. You are having the power cuts because the situation in Colombia, who is responsible for a large share of the export of energy to Ecuador, is actually shutting down the export because there's such an enormous drought in Colombia. If we look at Mexico, 2/3 of Mexico municipalities actually have serious and severe water challenges that hamper livability, productivity, and even thinking about allocating new industries in the country is at stake because of these kind of water challenges. Harini, I think 400 million new urban dwellers are expected by 2015 in India alone. So how do we deal with this water challenge? And for a long time, the water sector has been, indeed, the question is very spot on, has been very sectoralized. So views on that. And I know we have very limited time, but we can think in the next months about it, as you said, Harini. But some understanding of some views on this water issue and the urban challenge that we're facing. Who wants to chime in? Harini, are you?
Sure. I mean, I think two things in the interaction just would be critical for me. One is behavior in terms of consumption. So per capita consumption, how is that changing in different countries over time? Are people understanding that they can't consume so much? So that's one part of it. And the second is just buildings themselves. How much, I mean, we're talking about the energy footprint of buildings, and that's in here a lot. Also the embodied carbon, but what about the embodied water of buildings? I think that is something that is not talked about enough. So I think those are the two factors I would say.
Thanks, Harini. Anyone else?
Well, I think it really illuminates the challenge, obviously beyond mitigation, but around adaptation. And with the scale of disasters, the disruptions, the fact that 1 billion people don't have access to clean water still in the world, we've got huge infrastructure challenges right now. And we don't, if there's anywhere we're short on data, it's around adaptation, standardized data to understand who's ready for the next scale of devastation and displacement and challenge. So, and what infrastructure do we focus, as Harini said, what are the win-win-wins that get us multiple successes, triple word scores, we called them in Vancouver, so that we can deliver much more bang for our buck. But we have a lot of work to do, a ton of work on resilience.
Thanks a lot, Gregor. Alok, just briefly.
Yeah, and just it's not just access. I would also say that it's the quality of water, the pollution is also a very important element and needs to be part of that integrated, systems-based approach, and tracking of some of the pollution in water bodies for humans, for species is also important to track, and perhaps can be looked into by the Systems Change Lab as it evolves, going forward.
Thanks a lot to all of you for this very exciting conversation, which could go on for much longer, but we don't have the time. We're almost at the end of this conversation, at this presentation, the launch of the Cities and the Buildings Transition or Systems Change Lab. I'm not going to summarize, a lot has been said, but what is interesting to see is that the role of cities, not only delivering on large ambition, but actually driving innovation from the bottom up and making a change from the bottom up, is an enormous opportunity, and therefore data is crucial. And System Change Lab help us to have this data at the fingertips, not only static, but as you said, Harini, to play around with, to understand the impacts of action, and also to identify where we still have gaps. So as we know, and I want to ask everyone who joined, because you're interested, please have a look at systemschangelab.org to play around with the data, to look at the different transition, also beyond the Cities and the Buildings one. 15 systems have been identified for which data is available or continue to become available. I also want to address that, cities are not static places, right? They're continuously evolving, they're continuously moving, changing. So that also means that the System Change Lab is not a static place. We continue to update the data, to think about filling the gaps as we identified, and to update the dashboard. So it's worth to kind of keep System Change Lab at your fingertips. We are happy to continue this conversation in other moments coming up. The World Urban Forum next week in Cairo, the COP29 in Baku, where important conversations also on the role of NDCs and developing cities and countries are at stake. I want to thank you, the panel, for being fantastic, illuminating and energetic. I also want to thank the participants of this call in large numbers to be part of this conversation and to become part of this movement. It's this kind of evidence, data-driven movement of urban development planning and urban transition. I hope to see you all either with the next event of the System Change Lab or in WOOF at Cairo, COP29 Baku, or in any of the cities and transitions across this world. Thank you very much for joining. Thank you for the organizing. Thanks Systems Change Lab, New Climate Institute for organizing this. And hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.